In today's class, we are going to study about Richard II. He is known as the Boy King because when he ascended the throne, he was quite young. And even when he was young, he tried to intervene and take certain steps for the benefit of the people. So, history remembers him mainly as the Boy King. So, here is a picture of Richard II, the Boy King. He was the son of the Black Prince, if you remember, right? So his father had ruled the kingdom for Edward III for some time because his father had gone senile, but then he could not ascend the throne because before that he died, right? And after that, Edward III also had died. So the next person to ascend the throne was the son of the Black Prince, and he was named Richard. So he was the second Richard to sit on the throne. So we call him Richard the Second. So when he ascended the throne, things were really bad in England. The circumstances were really dire, really bad, and it led to one of the most famous revolts in history, the Peasants' Revolt, which we'll be looking at in the due course of time. So there was this widespread unemployment and discontent. And if you remember, one third of the population of England was dead and gone due to the Black Death, due to plague. So it's like one third of the population had died, and there was not enough people to cultivate the land. So there was this acute scarcity of labor. So there was a shortage of men and material, and labor was no longer cheap. So if you had to employ somebody to work for you, you really had to pay heavily. And because of which the land owners, they turned to sheep farming, which was more lucrative. So less of agriculture and more of sheep farming. During this time, uh, the kingdom, they also passed this statute of laborers. This prohibited the serfs from asking for more wages. So this again led to mass unemployment. And the clergy, on the other hand, they were corrupted to the core, and they were leading a luxurious life without really caring for the people. So these serfs and the villains, that is, these workers, the laborers, they felt abandoned by God and his representatives on earth, that is, all these clergymen, the priests. It was at this time you have John Wycliffe, one of the earliest and first reformers of the English church, entering the scene. So he and his followers were called Lollards. So their teachings and preachings found easy acceptance. So they preached against the kind of immoral and licentious lives that were led by the clergy. So they were trying to make the church religion more democratic and open for all, which was widely accepted by the people. And also you have the coming of revolutionary priests like that of John Bull. This was again the time when the people had to pay a new tax. It was called poll tax. So it was first imposed in 1377 and repeated every 3 years. So what is this poll tax? That is, you had to pay a certain sum of money to the court, to the kingdom. It did not take into account the income of the family and the rise in cost of living. So whether you had any money or not, whether you were employed or not, nothing was considered. You had to pay the tax. And what happened to the poor laborers? They had to pay more than half of their wages as poll tax. So what would they have in their hand, right? So there was discontent and unhappiness everywhere. So it was a terrible time to be. And there was this burden of heavy taxation and dire poverty, which we have already seen. And the parliament did not bother at all. They did not hear the voice of the people. And the king was the only hope. So these people, these farmers, all these laborers, they decided to march to London to meet the king. And they had a leader. His name was Wat Tyler. So there were these violent episodes in places like Kent, Essex, where the situations of the peasants were the worst off. So it was a violent uprising by the peasant group against the clergy and the noblemen at the court. So under the guidance of Wat Tyler, leadership of Wat Tyler, they all marched towards London. So now here you have the coming together of the peasants, right? So they were all highly energized, and they had a very powerful leader. So now what happened, the barons, both the spiritual and the secular, that is both the clergy as well as the noblemen, who had been cruel to all these peasants and serfs, they faced the retribution. So many of these people were killed by this mob fury. So they had organized themselves into a mob, but with a proper leader. So they felt invincible, and they felt so powerful that they took power into their hands, and they started killing all these people who had been so cruel to them. For instance, you have Archbishop of Canterbury Simon Sudbury and Sir Robert Hales, who was the treasurer to the king. They were dragged out of their houses and beheaded. So this came as a warning to all the privileged people. So this was quite unsettling for the people. Then the palace of John of Gaunt was burnt down, and the towns of Lambeth, Southwark, they were all sacked and burned down. There was atmosphere. There was this atmosphere of fear and tension among the noble people. And it was also a time of heady excitement for the peasants, because first time in their life they were experiencing some kind of power, and they were using that to take revenge on all those who had put them down. And Richard II, the boy king, he rose to the occasion, though he was quite young, and he met the peasants at this place called Smithfield. And the peasants, they made certain demands, and they were very just. And what were the demands? They wanted the abolition of oppressive laws and the system of villanage, that is kind of bonded labor. So they wanted the practice of bonded labor to be ended. And king said it was all right. So king agreed to these very reasonable demands. And at the same time, the king's courtiers, the royal people, they were not really happy with what the king was doing. So what did they do? They all got together behind the king's back, and they decided to put down the peasants rebellion. Because and they wanted to put them down in such a manner that they would never rise up in life. So in order to put down any rebellion, first you need to target their leader, right? So that's what they did. So what did they do? They killed their leader, Wat Tyler, on the pretext of threatening the king. So they just arrested him, had him arrested and executed. Now the crowds, they were without a powerful leader, so they were lost and scattered and confused, because most of them were illiterate people, right? So they needed a good leader. So with the absence of a leader, they were all scattered. So the next leader was this person called Jack Straw. He was not as charismatic and powerful and efficient leader as Wat Tyler. So the movement somehow lost steam, and there were these further sporadic violence and dissent, but they were all crushed, and all these insurgents, they were rounded up and punished. So this uprising, the peasants' revolt, was put down firmly, and there was a general amnesty. Amnesty is forgiveness. So general forgiveness was proclaimed, but none of the demands of the peasants were accepted. So though the king in word had said that he would look into it, he was not able to, because all the power was in the hands of lord appellants or chancellors. We'll see that why was King Richard II not really able to um, give in to their demands, or rather uh, follow the promises that he had made to them. Here we have a painting, an illustration of the peasants' revolt, the death of Wat Tyler. Here you can see Wat Tyler here, and then somebody trying to murder him. Again, you have another painting of the peasants' uprising. So you can see the clergy and the noble being rounded up, taken out of their homes and being executed by these peasants. So now, what were the results of the revolt? So though it was put down, it did have some far-reaching consequences. It sounded the death bell, the death knell of serfdom, and upper classes, they preferred to employ daily wagers than bonded laborers, because bonded laborer would mean a long-term commitment. Daily wages, as in when you require them, you could hire them, and then you could just let them off. So that was considered to be more convenient. So more or less, this bonded laborer system came to an end. And the lower classes, they were so bitter, they were embittered at their lot, and they were disenchanted with the clergy. So slowly people were moving away from the preachings of the clergy and teachings of the lollards, John Wycliffe and his followers. It was gaining more acceptance. And the clergy, on the nobility, on the other hand, they were very wary. They were wary of the peasants, because they realized that if they get well organized, they could be a threat to the powerful. So they also started dealing with these people in a more, you could say, measured manner. So they were wary, so they understood, they could not take these peasants for granted forever. So now Richard the Boy King, he was able to diffuse the tension, the tense situation at Smithfield. That is when he went to meet this warring and rioting group of peasants. But then he was not able to fulfill the promises that he made to the peasants, and he had to watch helplessly the murder of Wat Taylor and the others on the charges of insurgency and trying to harm the king. Why? Because he was considered too young to rule, and the land was ruled by a council of 5 ministers, and they were called the Lords Appellant. And what did they do? They dismissed the king's favorites from powers and positions. So whoever was close to Richard and whoever was appointed by Richard, they were all dismissed by these Lords Appellant. And main of them, the three main ones, uh, that is the Dukes of Gloucester, Arundel, and Warwick. They controlled and curtailed the king's power. And the king had to watch helplessly as his friends were executed on false charges. So, what were these men trying to do? The Lord Appellants, they were trying to curtail and curb the powers of Richard. And the best way to do that is by doing away with those who were close to him. So now, after some time, Richard decided that enough was enough and he was old enough to rule on his own. So here comes this phase wherein he becomes the brave king. So from the boy king, he becomes the brave king, and he declared himself old enough to rule in 1389, and he dismissed the Lords Appellant, and he filled all the positions with his men, and he was quite diplomatic and mature, so he did not go about taking revenge immediately. So he was biding and waiting for the time, because he had been dealt with quite a blow by all these men, especially those three, right? So he was just waiting. Whereas what happened was, these Dukes of Gloucester, Arundel, and Warwick, and also Henry, son of John of Gaunt, they thought that everything was forgotten, and everything was now happy, and the king wouldn't harm them. So all this was followed by years of peace, uh, and the king had become quite popular with the masses. But at the same time, king was not happy with the parliament, because it did not have the representatives as well as the interests of the common people. He was aware of that. The lowest rung in the society, they were not represented in the parliament. Please remember that, right? So he was not happy with that. So what did he do? He built his own loyal army, because there was this kind of a gulf between the king and especially these dukes, Gloucester, Arundel, and Warwick. So again, we have some pictures of King Richard II here. And Richard was a diplomat, and he did not want to get into unnecessary fights and battles and revenges just immediately after ascending the throne. And he was not in favor of fighting because of the economic costs involved. So what did he do? He got into a peace treaty with the French king, and he married his daughter, the French king's daughter, Isabel. So that cemented some kind of a peace between England and France. Then he built up a court party of faithful nobles, John of Gaunt, then his son Henry, and Thomas Mowbray, Earl of Norfolk. Please remember these names. Now, when everything was kind of settled, he decided it was time for revenge. So he ordered the execution of all those who had troubled him, including his own uncle, Duke of Gloucester. So Duke of Gloucester was his uncle. So even he was ordered to be executed. And Warwick, he was exiled to the Isle of Man because he was pretty old that time. And at the same time, there was a brawl between Henry and Thomas Mowbray. Henry is now the son of Duke of Gloucester, right? Sorry, John of Gaunt. So there was this fight between Henry and Thomas Mowbray. So this was an golden opportunity for Richard. What did he do? He banished both these men. Henry was banished for 1 year, and Mowbray was banished for life. Now, slowly, after sitting on the throne, and when things had all settled down, he slowly started to change. So now you have this phase wherein Richard becomes the despot. So from the boy king to the brave king to the diplomat, he becomes a despot. So he started behaving like a despot once his power was well established, and he put heavy taxes, and the powers were curtailed of those above the common level. So the middle class, the upper middle class, the nobles, they were the ones who were really targeted by him. He did not touch the peasants and the serfs. So what happened? The nobles and the merchant classes, they were put under the edicts, that is all kinds of rules and regulations of the king. He confiscated the vast property of his uncle John of Gaunt at his death. And he was in Ireland to put down a rebellion when Henry, the son of John of Gaunt, landed in London to claim his patrimony. If you remember, Henry had been exiled for a year, right? So now, when the king was away in Ireland, Henry, he came back. He came back and landed in England. So now, what happened? Many of these nobles, they were disillusioned. So all these nobles under Henry, his full name is Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster. So they marched to Bristol. He took the king's men under custody and had them hanged. So the king was away. So all these nobles, they got together under the leadership of Henry Bolingbroke, who had been exiled and who was now back to claim his patrimony, because all his land, everything that belonged to his father John of Gaunt, was taken away by the king. So you have this uprising against the king. What main reason was they were all unhappy because the king was imposing more taxes on these upper classes, and he had all kinds of laws and regulations made in order to curb their power. So there was discontent amongst the upper classes of society. So they all came together and joined forces under Henry Bolingbroke. So now Richard, he becomes the dethroned. So what happened now? Richard was in Ireland. So when he returned to the capital city, he found that Henry Bolingbroke had taken over the power. So Richard had no choice, but he had to relinquish the throne and hand over the crown to Henry, because he had the support of all the other people, right? The clergy and the nobility. And Richard, he was imprisoned at Pontefract Castle, and he was the hope of the poor and the marginalized. He actually stood for them, and all the other classes did not really interest him. So he was the hope of the poor and the marginalized, and he is remembered as the good King Richard, who had promised them freedom. But it never came to pass. But before that, he was kind of dethroned. So with him, you have the end of the direct Angevin bloodline. So with him, the Angevin bloodline comes to an end, because Henry Bolingbroke, now he sits on the throne of England. Now this later led to the dispute between the descendants of the two other sons of Edward III for the crown, and that led to what is known as the Wars of the Roses, the War of the Roses. So why it is called War of the Roses and what had happened, that we'll see in another class. So you have a painting here from that time which depicts Henry Bolingbroke claiming the throne. So, with the end of Richard II, or with his imprisonment and dethroning, we have the end of the Angevin bloodline. So, you have another bloodline sitting on the throne of England.